Hello everyone, it is Pelicandude, and welcome back to episode 5. So I've been gone for a week, and I'm back now, so as you realized, there was an absence of videos from the channel, and indeed, there was an absence of me from my computer. But now that I have returned safely to the command center, we shall resume our glorious quest to explore the entire Kerbal system. So first off, let's go ahead and spend that science that we got last mission. So I think we'll do heavy rocketry so we can get some of those 2.5 meter parts, so it'll be useful later on down the road. And then we'll probably want advanced construction, or perhaps we can do precision engineering actually, so we can actually unlock some of our military parts, but, you know, that's not relevant until next episode anyway. We could do aerodynamics, so we could get access to some basic aircraft parts, or advanced flight control, which this could be incredibly useful because we'll have RCS and stuff like that. So we've got lots of choices. I think that, oh, as you can see, I installed another mod. I have now installed Kerbal aircraft expansion, so that's going to give us better access to some various aircraft parts. I might install some B9 stuff for better wings too. I'm not quite sure, but let's just look around here. So we already have landing legs because we really want to start prepping for our mission to the moon. So we can definitely want RCS, and we definitely probably want advanced construction, and that gives us most of what we need. And we can now get one of these wonderful advanced nodes here. So we could get the heavier rocketry, so we could get the mainsail and the orange tank, two signatures of the Kerbal Space Program. We could get, we can't really get supersonic flight yet. Oh, we could get specialized control, we could get an actual lander module, or the 3 Kerbal ship, but we need aerodynamics for that. We could obviously get guns, we could get advanced electronics, but yeah, that's about it for right now. How about we actually go ahead and get space exploration? We'll just finish off with these here, and that way we'll have access to, where is it? Yeah, these newfangled ladder things that we don't actually need going to the moon because the EVA packs are enough to actually fly on the moon because gravity is so low. But, you know, they'll be nice to have anyway in case, you know, EVA pack gets disabled or something due to voodoo magic that won't happen. But, yeah, actually, in this episode, we're going to be doing more than just prepping our Munar mission. Well, we are going to be prepping our Munar mission and launching it, hopefully, if things go well. But we're actually going to have some dual launches going on in this episode. We are going to be establishing for ourselves a little network of communication satellites, I think. I think that'll be making a lot of sense. We don't actually need them, but considering if we're going to the moon and other foreign bodies, we really want to be able to talk to the Kerbal Space Center. And the best way to do that is to make sure we always have line of sight on something that has line of sight on the Kerbal Space Center. So I think that the best option for that will be a network of comm satellites. So let's get started on that. Alright, so here we are on the launch pad of the first ComSat, and this is going to be a very interesting little launch. I decided to kind of throw most logic and reason out the window in building this vehicle. So there are some things that make a little bit of sense, but they're a little bit silly at the same time. So as you can see, we have these external fuel tanks that we're going to ditch away from the main core. And then also the configuration of these SRBs is a little bit fun and unique. So in theory, these SRBs will stick together when they separate, and will just pull themselves back away from the ship using these little Separatron engines that will fire at the same time as the decouplers, of course. So yes, this will be a rather interesting launch. There's the satellite itself on top. There's lots of antennas and things of that nature, and we'll go ahead and launch the rocket. So we'll throttle up, activate SAS, and fire. Alright. I'm going to try and keep track as best I can of just how much fuel. There we go. So the little bottom ones have run out of fuel, and now these will begin using up fuel. But we got to keep track of those so that way we know when to stage them off. Exactly. We're not going to turn over until we hit 10 kilometers because that is an efficient way of doing things, of course. Just making sure, again, I've never made a rocket quite like this one, so just making sure everything stays relatively sane for the duration of the flight. And we're almost out of liquid fuel in these little side tanks. These should start draining momentarily. Yep. And SRBs are now gone, so we're going to deploy those. Oh, did not have quite successful separation, but, you know, it worked well enough, I suppose. And we'll go ahead and start tipping over now, so we can adjust for our orbital insertion. And here we go, we'll ditch these. There we go, and they fall away from the spacecraft. And we are left with our rocket core. So basically, that's the same as starting this rocket at about 10 kilometers with full fuel. So, you know, not horrible at all. Not perhaps the most ingenious launch solution, but one that I can have a little bit of fun with. And we were definitely having a bit of wobble going on in that spacecraft. Fairings will be nice. Fairings will allow me to not worry about some of the nonsense, plus just some of the more advanced construction that we will unlock later on in the tech tree. Now, you may notice this is a fairly basic comm satellite. That's because we can't, like, deploy solar arrays or anything, because we haven't actually unlocked that kind of solar technology, one might say. But what we do have is this design that I think kind of almost looks like something out of Star Trek, where it would be like a comm buoy. You'll get a better view of it once it's actually detached, and you will have a better understanding of exactly what I mean by that. We're going to go ahead and tip all the way over to 45 degrees now, far above the Kerbal Space Center. And here we are. This is well on its way to Kerbal Stationary Orbit. So, for anyone who doesn't know what Kerbal Stationary Orbit is, or what geostationary orbit is, for that matter, geostationary orbit, which is what Kerbal Stationary Orbit is, of course, based off of, is the idea of putting a satellite up at the right altitude that it orbits at the same rate that the planet turns, and therefore it is always in the same position relative to the planet. And so let's say this is particularly useful for a communication satellite or something, which is what this is, because what can happen then is, let's say it needs to be in constant communication with Kerbal Space Center. We can put it into Kerbal Stationary Orbit, like here, and it'll just orbit with the rotation of the planet, meaning that we don't have to worry necessarily about anything such as ever losing sight of, you know, the Kerbal Space Center, and therefore our radio beams and waves they can't reach around the planet. Like, let's say you're trying to communicate from here to a satellite that's here, you can't really do that because you have to go through the center of the planet. But with the Kerbal Stationary Orbit, it'll just stay in the same place relative to the particular position on Kerbin the whole time of its duration in orbit. So it's very useful for things like communication satellites, you know, TV satellites, things of that nature is what geostationary orbits are used for. And so geostationary orbit, or Kerbostationary orbit in Kerbal Space Program, is an orbit that is approximately 2,868.75 kilometers at a speed of 1,009 meters per second. So that is roughly the target that we're aiming for. If we get a little bit off, we'll still be okay, because it will just orbit so slowly that it won't really matter that we're a little bit off. And then we'll probably put a couple more of these satellites up on geostationary orbits as well in different parts of the planet, so that way we'll have several of them, so we'll always be guaranteed to have a line of sight on whatever spacecraft we need to communicate with. And we're going to go ahead and start our low Kerbin orbit insertion right about now. But yeah, that is the plan, and I'll talk to you guys again pretty soon. All right, now while that satellite is going out to Kerbal Stationary Orbit, we actually have another mission prepped here on the pad. So this guy will probably be still on his mission when we land on the moon, but this guy is going to Minimus, the second natural satellite that is orbiting around Kerbin, and he'll be doing some science there. He won't be landing there, but he'll just be orbiting around it, kind of doing the same thing we did last episode with the moon, but for Minimus. So let's take a look at this rocket. So first of all, we probably would have been fine with basically the same rocket we sent to the moon to orbit it, but instead we added a couple things. So we added thermometers, because we just unlocked those so we can get some more scientific data from temperature. We added some communications devices, so that way we can actually talk to the Kerbal Space Center. And we gave it bigger solid rocket boosters, because we all know that in Kerbal Space Program, the best way to solve a problem is to add more boosters. Oh, and we also fixed the fuel lines running between these that we previously did not have. So we should have much better delta V and efficiency on this spacecraft than we had on the original moonshot. And as you can see, the name of our Kerbal here that we've chosen to pilot this craft is Donbald Kerman. I think that this is appropriate because it'll take probably about 3 weeks to make this whole mission happen from the time we launch it to the time he gets back. So it makes sense that someone with a name like Donbald, his hair probably won't grow particularly quickly, or maybe not at all. And so, you know, he won't have to worry about getting his hair cut while he's on this long, extended mission. And perhaps this will allow the scientists to study the effects of space travel on bald people. So here we go. Let's throttle up the spacecraft and fire. So we are released from our structural supports, and up we go. These solid rocket boosters are much stronger than the previous versions, and they should get us much higher. But that will all be seen in the future, because for now we're just going to cut. Now this is interesting. We seem to be developing a bit of a backwards roll here. It's very odd. When we separate, we should be able to correct it with our controllable. There we go. Thankfully we didn't go too far the other way, or else we'd have a little bit, quite a bit of delta V to kill. And that would be very unfortunate, because obviously we're already wasting some fuel just by doing this, and so we didn't want to waste any more. But thankfully we seem to be back on the right track now, having gotten rid of the SRBs. The SRBs, of course, did help quite a bit in getting into our necessary position for doing an orbital insertion. But for now, we are on our liquid engines, and they will get us the rest of the way to our target, which I do not believe is visible right now. There's the moon. But let's go ahead and turn over to 45 degrees. It's about time anyway. We probably should have done it earlier had it not been for the confusion. I don't know if Minimus is really visible at present. But yeah. So we're well on our way. Alright, so now we are in a stable orbit, and we've set Minimus as our target. Now, something that's interesting to note about Minimus is it is in an inclined orbit. So if you see, the moon is pretty much perfectly equatorial with Kerbin, but Minimus is, of course, not, because it was probably a captured comet or something that strayed a little bit too close to Kerbal. That doesn't really explain why it has such a perfectly circular orbit, but oh well. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to actually correct the inclination of our orbit to make it a little bit easier for us to go there. Now, another thing is that Minimus is actually approaching right now the time when it is pretty much in line with the equator, so we could just aim for it more or less the same way we would aim for the moon, but just for the sake of being, I don't know, fairly realistic, we'll go ahead and make our correction, especially since we have plenty of delta V, and we will match inclinations with Minimus. So as you can see, you make inclination corrections by pointing either normal or anti-normal at the descending and ascending node, respectively. And as you can see, we've now gotten it to 0.0 and 0.0. So we are exactly matched in terms of our inclination with Minimus. So we can go ahead and we can start aiming for it now. We do this in a slightly similar way to that we do with the moon. We just point ahead of it, and we try and guesstimate exactly how we want to do this. And then you just want to play with your maneuver node until you get an encounter. So as we can see, we have a very low periaps over Minimus now, and we will be there in 6 days and 6 minutes, and then we'll be able to do all kinds of yummy science, get into orbit around Minimus, and then eventually come back. So yeah, now we should switch back to our ComSat that we're trying to put into a Kerbal stationary orbit. So we'll switch back here, now that it'll be taking a while to have the spacey moonshot get out to Minimus. That should probably be more technically named the Minimus shot, but oh well, I forgot to rename the spacecraft that I slightly modified for the purpose of doing that mission. So we are going to be getting ourselves into a nice Kerbal stationary orbit here. We're not going to be quite over the Space Center, so we can't quite talk to it all the time, so we'll need to, like I said though, we were already planning on sending up a couple of these to different parts of Kerbin, so that way we'll be able to communicate just about wherever we want to, and that should work nicely. So this will be the first edition of our network. We'll probably do 2 or 3 more, depending on how I feel like, and then we probably are going to put various communication stations all over this place, just for the sake of realism and because I want to. And launching satellites is fun, and we want to have a full-looking orbital array by the time that this series is over. So we need to target our prograde vector. So there we go, we're spinning around towards it again. One of the ways we can actually figure out whether we're on an exactly equatorial orbit or not is, since the moon is basically on an exactly equatorial orbit, is we can target the moon and then adjust our inclination compared to the moon until it reads 0, 0, and then we'll be effectively on an equatorial orbit. So we're just going to wait until that gets up to about 28, which is right about there. And then we're going to zip up to it, and we're going to correct to circularize our orbit. And yeah, we actually do need to add a couple kilometers to it, but we just are going to go a little bit at a time to make sure we get into exactly the orbit we want to. And as you can see, we have now gotten ourselves into a fairly Kerbal-stationary orbit. Again, we still need to make a few corrections, but we're getting closer and closer, and we're going to go ahead, and since we're close to the descending node, we're going to circularize, or equatorialize this perfectly. And as we can see, our spacey moonshot is getting closer to its destination. We are not going to be going to the moon in this episode. I decided it's already getting a little bit too long, so we're just going to be finishing up with this ComSat and getting into the Minimus sphere of influence, and then episode 7, I suppose, will be where we actually do our mission to the moon. Being episode 6, we need to worry about making the military happy. And there we go, on a perfectly equatorial orbit. Alright, and there we go. We are in what might be called a roughly Kerbal-stationary orbit. I might use MechJeb on the next launch to get it just about perfect, but this is about going to be as close as you can get manually. We can try for a little bit more. Oh, but we just screwed it up a bit. Oh, well. So, yes, we'll try and fix that. And there we go. Again, back to about as good as we're going to be getting. So, one thing that the astute observer might have noticed about this spacecraft, let me just check and make sure we're on a still good for Minimus, is that we can decouple this. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to decouple the spacecraft if it'll let me. So we're going to disable SAS and decouple, and then I'm going to switch over to this spacecraft, and I'm actually going to use RCS to get it out of here as best I can. We're going to switch over to docking, and then we can use RCS to actually propel ourselves kind of normally, one might say. And now that we're a decent distance away, we are going to go ahead, point retrograde, and get out of here, because we really don't want to... Oops, wow, this is interesting. So let's, we want to get this booster stage away from the spacecraft. So if we go back over to this ComSat 1, we're going to say control from here, yes. Action group 1, and bam! Look at that lovely communication array. And this has RCS, so it can actually maneuver on orbit a little bit. But isn't that gorgeous? It was all worth it in the end, wasn't it? So we're going to turn on our SAS. We're going to point radial, or I guess maybe anti-radial in this case. Yes, and bam! We are going to swing around to face the planet and begin fulfilling our purpose as a communication station for all Kerbal kind. That is a beautiful communication satellite, I must say. Just all, excuse me, all those antennas. I mean, it's kind of different looking, but again, it looks like some sort of buoy or something, like a communications buoy from Star Trek. So we're going to switch back here. We're going to fire retrograde, and oops, we're going to activate engine, if it'll let me. And we're going to drop ourselves back onto the planet. Saying goodbye to the ComSat, we're going to stop firing our engines as it shoots past us, just so that way we can avoid... We're going to switch back to it really quick. It's about right. We can use RCS to correct it a little bit if we feel the need to. But we're going to drop ourselves right onto the planet, so that way there's, again, no space junk. Alright, and now we are back to the Minimus ship, heading off further. It is now officially further than any Kerbal has ever been before, far leaving behind the moon and the Munar orbit, where previously we've explored. We're going to go ahead and time warp, and as you can see, that looks pretty cool how the communication satellite there is orbiting about the same rate as the day-night cycle. But as you can see, this is a pretty long duration mission. We're already more than 4 days, 5 days out, and have yet to reach our target, but there we go. We are now within Minimus's sphere of influence. We're going to get down to our periaps, 65 kilometers. That's one thing when you're shooting for Minimus, is your periaps, never count on it being exactly what the game tells you it's going to be. It might be close. Oh, and look at that. We're pretty close to a retrograde vector already. Isn't that nice? So we can go ahead and just fire when ready, one might say. So we'll go back to our spacecraft and fire up the engines. We, of course, want to leave this engine on a trajectory where it will impact the surface of Minimus. Again, all in the name of preserving space. So we'll go down, make our periaps. There we go, into Minimus's surface. Ditch this stage. And then fire up our next stage. There we go. And this time we want to actually point around prograde, and that way we will not smash horribly into the surface. And there we go. We have a nice orbit around Minimus. We have our booster section going off to impact the surface and not take up space junk. We have the first communication satellite in Kerbostationary orbit. And why does it say it's not in Kerbostationary orbit? Apparently, we're not in Kerbostationary orbit. Alright, well, we'll have to correct that in the future. But, of course, that will be in the future. So thank you for watching, everyone, and I hope that you all have a nice day.